Alright, this is going to be our abridged and condensed versions of Chapter 10 and Chapter 11 lectures into one. Since we're not going to spend a ton of time on this, you should be aware of all the information in here, but we're only going to focus on a couple of key pieces of information during this particular slideshow. Starting with Tragedy of the Commons, which we went over in our Happy Fishing game. The idea that if a commons is being used to excess, then we can expect that resource to become diminished and unable to support the activity. And in most cases, that means that that resource is gone and cannot be used again, and we have to look for new resources. So in terms of land management, that's a very important piece, because as we continuously use resources without allowing them to replenish themselves, and it does come true with farming as well, we have to look for more and more resources, and we do live in a world of finite resources. You should know these differentiations between different public lands, so national parks, resource protected areas. So again, the big thing to look for is going to be who runs them and what their goal is. So natural parks, we see scientific, educational, recreational use.
May I have your attention? Please disregard.
And we see that with managed resources, we're talking about resource use here. So national parks and managed resource protected areas obviously have different uses to them. So we do define them as different areas. And we can see we have a couple of different uses in terms of our public lands. Nice graph here showing you a couple of outlines of where some of this stuff is located, or where the different agencies are that run some of these particular things, including forests, national parks, Tennessee Valley Authority, and things of that nature. Now this is a nice one, because this is a nice chart of what land use is, if we think of on a global basis. So the big thing is, where do we see the large ones? So the largest three numbers here are our grassland and grazing land, our timber production, and our cropland. Almost 75% of all land use is either for farming, or for forested land used for timber production, which means that we're using most of our land to support food and production goods. That's an issue that we need to be concerned with going forward when we consider wildlife and recreational lands only 11%, and the amount of land that people live on and use for everyday activities only makes about 4%. So what is a rangeland? So a rangeland is basically a prairie, what we would consider a prairie. It's just a plot of land that's being used for cattle grazing. Forests, we know forests have large woody trees. Now when it comes to the actual clearing of those forests, we have a couple of animals here: clear cutting, selective cutting. Basically the two main ways that we're going to see timber harvested or taken and used in resources. Clear cutting basically meaning clearing out an area. Selective cutting, obviously, just removing a couple of single trees. Obviously, this one has a larger impact, but this one is also going to lead to larger profit margins for the companies doing it. And we see that we have a smaller opportunity for maintaining larger trees. So yard change habitats when we do clear cutting at a much greater extent than versus selective cutting. The federal regulations, I would say, might worth looking up on your own time. We know residential land is defined as suburban, and the term exurban here is basically somewhere in between urban and suburban, just for when you see that term and what that term actually means. So we could see that over the last handful of decades, we see population sizes in particular areas. We see a nice noticeable change here. The amount of people living in suburbs has drastically increased. The amount of people living in urban areas has increased, and the amount of people living in rural areas has decreased. So we know we know that this thing called urban sprawl is happening. So urban sprawl basically means that people leaving rural areas and going into urban areas. So what does that mean for us? Well, what are we worried about in this class? Physical development and land construction, materials to build roads, destruction of natural lands in order to build highways and roads, cost of living increase. So since living costs are increasing, we're spending more money and becoming more of a consumer-driven society, the more that our living costs increase. Urban blight. City revenue shrinks as people move to our suburbs, meaning that people realize with living costs that living in a city is much more expensive. Your traditional city center area, as opposed to living in the suburbs where you can get more land and like a larger house. Urban blight means that we start to see people in the urban areas, the number of people living there starts to decrease, and that has a negative impact on those areas. And we're worried about government policies that favor urbanization, which will basically exacerbate these other three ideas here. These are some good graphs that give you some idea of what happens in terms of urban sprawl and suburban shift. With fewer people in an urban area, businesses will start to leave because they're not making money. Neighborhoods begin to decline. Populations are shifting to the suburbs. Tax revenues decline, which means that we have fewer services provided. In terms of the suburban expansion, we see that as suburbs expand, we have increased traffic congestion, meaning longer commutes, meaning more gas is being used. Higher gas tax revenues means more highway construction, and we see a couple of loops here that feed into each other. Now, so what would be a good idea? Well, all these policies that are under smart growth are worth looking at, especially if we're asking ourselves, well, what's the alternative to traditional urban sprawl and land use? And we see a couple of different things here. Mixed land uses, so urban, suburban, or I should say urban and natural landscapes mixed together. We'll look at a couple of these examples in class. Compact building designs, preservation of open space and natural beautiful areas, strengthening the development of existing communities instead of building new ones. And developing more land to build new communities rather than focusing on an existing community. And that brings us to our feeding the world, which we'll spend a little bit more time in class talking about. So for your lab activity, you had to look at malnutrition and undernutrition on a global level, basically trying to afford diets given a particular budget. And we see that as cost of living globally, cost of food has gone up, we also see a direct relationship with the number of people who, as populations have risen in the last 20 years, how the number of people who don't have proper nutrition has increased dramatically. So undernutrition means not getting enough calories to be healthy. Undernutrition means, so in terms of our lab, not being able to get daily recommended number of calories. The other poor alternative is being malnourished or malnutrition, which is when you get enough calories but you're lacking the essential macros, things like proteins, vitamins, minerals. And overnutrition is what we see in more developed countries, where too many calories and access to food and the not having the need to spend so much money on food means we can buy more than is usually necessary because we have the ability to spend more. Extra calories and macros can tend to lead to things like obesity and a larger portion of our population becoming overweight. A good way to look at feeding the world is to look at global versus United States per meat capita consumption. Meat is considered a high-price commodity on a global scale. If you're able to afford meat as part of your diet, that's a sign of affluence. And if we look at the United States versus the global level, while both have increased, we've been far and away greater in terms of meat consumption than the rest of the world on average. Now this is where we start to see some interesting stuff. You look at grain production versus in a total versus per capita grain production. This is where we start to see issues. If we were meeting the needs of the individuals globally, then total grain production and per capita grain production should both be going up. The problem is that while grain production is linear in terms of its growth, meaning we get more on average each year, but not by much, per capita grain consumption hasn't increased by nearly the same scope, which means that yes, we are making more food, but there's not more food available per person. And that's where we start to see problems with lack of food in poorer countries. And obviously poverty is the big one in terms of why we see parts of the world have poor nutrition. Political and economic factors, again, basically go back to poverty. And then agricultural resources being diverted. So we see this happen in countries that export crops that are considered developing countries, where if they are growing or using land and raising cattle, again, we talked about how meat is a sign of affluence in terms of diet, rather than countries using that extra food to feed people. That food goes towards feeding animals, and that's a reason that is, factors into why some parts of the world have issues with nutritional levels. So you might hear this green revolution in terms of food, and what it basically means is, the ability to use less. We talked about irrigation and water use a couple of chapters ago, changing crop varieties, and basically, resisting the old tactics of farming and agriculture, which were wasteful, and trying to use less while still getting a higher yield in terms of crops and in terms of food amounts. Now, when it comes to fertilizers, we already talked about water, so I'm not going to rehash that. But when it comes to fertilizers, you might hear organic and inorganic. So when we're talking about those terms in terms of fertilizer, we're talking about natural fertilizer, usually decomposed manure, versus a synthetic compound that's made in a lab in a factory somewhere. Obviously, in terms of impacts, global impacts, organic fertilizers, since they are a natural product and don't require any more consumption of materials to create, are going to be less impactful and less dangerous in terms of their use. Inorganic synthetic fertilizers can tend to build up because they don't break down as easily since they are not natural, and those can cause issues. Another issue that the Green Revolution tries to solve is monocropping, which is basically where we have fields, and you see this is how most commercial farming is done, where we have large fields of just one crop. Those aren't necessarily good for our local environments because they leach a very large amount of specific nutrients and specific levels out of crops, out of the soil, leaving the soil pretty useless going forward, and it would require a long period of time in order to fix itself naturally. Another issue with food production is the idea of not wanting to lose food and not wanting to lose profits to bugs and pests, hence the pesticides. And we know that a pesticide, or we'll say a pesticide, is basically something that kills or controls an organism that we would consider pest. And if we're talking about farm, we're talking about something that will make food unsellable or unedible. So insecticides or pesticides that target insects, herbicides target plants. Now, in terms of Green Revolution, we want to focus on selective pesticides because selective pesticides will be less impactful than a broad spectrum, which are basically designed to kill many individuals. We also want them to be non-persistent. So if they're natural, selective, non-persistent, they will break down very rapidly. They will do their job and they do not remain in the environment. They get recycled back into natural elemental cycles. Persistent pesticides are usually inorganic ones, synthetic ones, and they're broad spectrum because they just get used. Those also happen to be the cheapest ones, which is why they get used so much. Another problem with pesticides is, the ones that are persistent, that get into organisms, that don't break down, lead to problem of bioaccumulation, like we mentioned with DDT, building up in smaller organisms and then getting passed on up the trophic levels of the food chain. We call it bioaccumulation, so that by the time it reaches the top of the food chain, there's a large amount in that particular organism of this toxin, or in this case we're talking about pesticides, that could lead to some physical problems in that top organism. And since humans are top organisms of their food chains, that definitely can lead to some problems. Another issue with pesticides is the idea of resistance. Same with bacterial resistance to antibiotics. Pesticide resistance is that, some organisms might be resistant, they survive, and those are the ones that reproduce and pass on those genes via natural selection. which means that we need a whole new range of pesticides to deal with the next organisms. And since these pests are usually small insects or funguses, they have very short generational times and they reproduce very rapidly. Think R strategists. And since they're R strategists, we need to constantly make new pesticides to keep up with the growing changes of the pests in these farms. Now, one major topic in terms of feeding the world is weighing the pros and cons of genetically engineering food or genetically modifying food. You've probably heard the term GMO before when it's referred to food. Now, there are benefits to it because genetic engineering of food does lead to many of these things happening. Greater yields because the food itself is larger, so we're physically making the potential to be larger, I guess we should say. So the food itself is, we are making more food and we are making more quality food because we are basically selecting for particular traits in our food. We have to use less pesticides because the food we're making is resistant to pests and not as attractive to pests. We will lower world hunger. We could lower world hunger amounts and malnutrition because of this increased food production. And companies are able to make more money off of this because they do spend less on management. The concerns are where genetically modified food becomes a big question. We don't know everything about the safety for human consumption. We don't know what the long-term effects of eating genetically modified food are because we haven't been eating it for a very long time. We don't know how it's going to impact biodiversity in terms of taking, let's say, all tomato plants and only having one genetically modified plant as opposed to having many, various hybrid strains that could be better suited to different situations. We lose biodiversity and we lose genetic biodiversity by having this, and that could potentially cause problems down the road. And we don't have any regulation right now. It's still a very new industry that is spending a lot of money at the top in terms of lawmaking and policy making to make sure that they can work without a very strict regulation. So when we look at farming methods, we look at what we consider traditional and different various kinds of agriculture. Conventional agriculture is basically where labor is reduced and machinery is used. That's more what we consider agricultural today, as opposed to traditional farming, where human labor, small farms still rely on a lot of traditional farming methods. Developing countries still rely on a lot of traditional farming methods. Shifting agriculture is what we see in areas that don't have good soils, or we see this in areas that are depleted of nutrients, where we basically use up everything in those poor soils and then move on until that soil is no good anymore, and then basically leave it alone. Fortunately, this is a problem with monocropping because when this issue involves using up a lot of land and not using it particularly well when it is being used. And when land is used up and loses its nutrients and its water content, we call that desertification, because that land can no longer support any kind of life. It can't support any kind of vegetation or primary productivity, and basically does not become productive. So we see areas here on this graph. The yellow are basically low vulnerability, meaning less likely to happen. The reds are the high areas where this is very likely to happen. And unfortunately, we don't see, the more red areas there are, those are areas that, if not properly maintained, could lead to more issues with farming on a global level and food production. So what are the sustainable methods to prevent that? Well, intercropping means planting multiple species, taking advantage of the nutrient contents for multiple plant species at the same time. Rotating crops from season to season. We'll look at examples of all of these. Agroforestry means growing foods in forested areas that have trees, because we know that we have soil there that is very strong and we're not going to be able to deplete it. We're also not going to be able to plant as much due to space and shade, but we do know that we can sustainably grow vegetables in that. And contour plowing we'll get into a little bit more of in class as well. You see a little bit of the pictures here. Let's go back quick. See a couple of pictures here. There we go. see a couple of pictures here in terms of what we mean by intercropping and contour plowing and agroforestry, which we will talk about a little bit more in class. We'll talk about no-till in class a little bit more, which helps prevent desertification as well. Integrated pest management can be solved with this. Basically, integrated pest management is basically designed with the goal of minimizing pesticide inputs by doing some of these sustainable agricultural practices. And then the term organic when in related to food. So what we mean by organic is we're not using synthetic pesticides or fertilizers. It just means that that crop is grown with natural fertilizer. Any pesticides used are natural. Basically, we're not using any kind of man-made artificial materials. Another term you might hear in relation to farm is this CAFO, concentrated animal feeding operations. If you think Food Inc. and the things that you've seen when you watch Food Inc., that's what we mean by CAFOs. Basically, we have these large structures and high density number of animals. So we have a lot of waste, we have a lot of bacteria, we have a lot of issues, and these are just basically meant to be like your assembly line type of animal farms. And we'll get into a little bit more about some of the issues with that, but you can see that one of the big things is the treatment of certain animals, and we see a lot of small confined spaces and a lot of just dirt and waste everywhere, and high chances for disease, and a disease in these areas can spread very, very quickly because they're so densely populated. Fisheries and shellfish in terms of food we'll look at in depth a little bit more in class, but basically fisheries are, when we say fishery, we're talking about a population of fish that can be harvested and sold. When fisheries collapse, we were losing a large percentage of that, and we can see that global fish production has kind of steadied off, but the rise of aquaculture, which is basically fish farming, has increased. And we'll talk about the benefits and the drawbacks of aquaculture, basically the farms of fish and shellfish in class as well. So lots of material within 2 chapters, but cut down into one particular lecture. And we will focus more in depth in class on some of the more specific things that I will highlight for you. And after this, we'll move on to some of our energy, climate, and pollution topics to wrap up our coursework for AP Environmental Science.